short. We are recording this. I hope no one has an issue with us recording that. If you do, please raise your hand now. Good, I can see no hands. Thank you. So this is our inaugural session. Tristan and I set this rig up about a year ago, and we've been working towards this. So we're absolutely delighted to have this highly respected and esteemed panel today for your viewing pleasure, who I will now go on to introduce one by one. I think the topic of today's session is of increasing importance, given what is happening with and to international schools, to their growth, to their expansion. And so without further ado, I will start to introduce, and I will start off with Tristan. So Tristan Bunnell, who's probably known to most of you, is a senior lecturer in international education at the University of Bath. And prior to joining Bath in 2014, he had taught IBDP economics in international schools for 25 years. So hello, Tristan.
Hello. Thank you. Am I ready to go?
No, I'm just going to introduce Lucy and Mark, and then I'll come straight back to you.
Okay.
Then Lucy. So Lucy Bailey is Dean of Bahrain Bahrain Teachers College. She has written extensively about international aspects of education, including international schooling, internationalization of higher education, and refugee education. Hello, Lucy.
Hello everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. And now I move on to Mark. Mark Gibson is a senior lecturer at Brooks University.
Song last year.
Somebody's got their microphone on and they're talking. Thank you. Mark Gibson is a senior lecturer at Oxford Brookes University and was previously an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. He has taught in state-funded schools in England for 30 years, including 10 in senior leadership. Mark has published widely on school leadership, including international schools. Hello, Mark.
Hi, thank you, and looking forward to today's session. Very happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Right, I'll go straight back now to Tristan, and I asked each of the contributors to both select a publication which they thought was worthy to foreground, and Tristan selected this one. It's Bunnell and Gardner McTaggart. It's a piece that Tristan and I wrote a couple of years ago together, led by Tristan. It's called The Cultural Capital of Senior Leaders in Elite Traditional International Schools, an Enduring Leadership Nobility, ? In the International Journal of Leadership in Education. If you're familiar with Tristan's work, you'll know that Tristan has almost written the book on the definitions and understandings of international schools. So we're very expectant and very happy to have you here, Tristan. Your prompt that you then brought to us today is one that I've subtitled as Monotone Leadership of Diversity. And the prompt is in more detail as follows: the enduring diversity paradox, the continuous growth in number and diversity of schools within the arena of K-12 English medium international schooling has seen entry globally by new markets of investors, parents, and teachers, yet does not seem to have been matched by a diversity of type of senior leader. This issue needs further critical research and sociological explanation. Over to you, Tristan.
Yeah, well, thank you, Alex. Yeah, so you can see from that prompt that my interest over many years now has been about the trends and developments concerning international schooling, what I call international schooling, so K-12 English medium of instruction schools overseas that are teaching a curriculum in English, but are probably not in an English-speaking nation, something like that. We can debate what an international school is, but that's sort of roughly what we're talking about. We're talking about a field of about, I don't know, 14,000 schools, and some of them, yeah, and growing at a rate of 2 per day. And that's been the case for quite a few years now, and looks set to continue to be the case. So this is a growing arena. It's still very under-researched, and particularly under-theorized. I think I'm fair to say that. So there's been quite a lot of descriptive narrative over the years to establish the field, establish the arena fields. And I think now we're in a position where we can start to theorize it a bit more and make more sense of it. It's big enough to be able to establish what's going on and to apply particularly sociological theory, but it's open to psychological theory or social anthropology or political economics, whatever. And I would welcome contributions from different sort of areas of academic activity. So you'll notice from the prompts that the word enduring kind of came up, and I think what I'm particularly interested in is the sort of structural, quite deep-rooted dimensions of international schooling that are now becoming very clear. But there are a lot of things that are changing, and a lot of huge transitions going on, and have gone on, and will continue to go on. But there are also some quite structural issues that are becoming sort of quite clear that they are enduring, and they're continuing, and they need to be discussed and theorized. And there's particularly this issue about the what I refer to as the leadership diversity paradox. So we've got this contradiction, or this paradox, where we've got major changes that have occurred within the arena in terms of the diversity of the schooling, diversity of the curricula that's offered, moving away from the IB towards other curricula. And there's been a big change in the clientele in terms of the parent body. We believe it's now sort of 80% local rather than 80% expatriate. And obviously, therefore, the student body, we're seeing much more diversity in terms of the student body. We're also seeing much more diversity in terms of the teachers, and more local host nation teachers joining the fields as well. At the same time, there doesn't appear, and I say this because we need more research. We need more research into it, into different types of schools, different regions. But it does appear that there hasn't been the similar change in the diversity of the senior leadership in the schools. So what I mean by that is that the leadership, particularly the senior leadership, by that I mean the directors, the head teachers, they still seem to be in the main Anglo-Western white men, to put it sort of fairly simply. And that seems to be a sort of a structural issue. And I say it needs more research. And the research I've been doing with Alex, and we've written a paper and we've presented at Belmas twice. We're presenting in Glasgow in July on this topic. So hopefully we might see some of you there. So yeah, this topic is obviously needs some sort of theorization. We've been applying Bourdieu's doxa concept, which implies that there's some sort of it's become so deep-rooted and so structural that people don't discuss it because it just happens. It just is because it is. You know, and it's also misrecognized as other things. So it's not seen as a bias towards certain people or a discrimination against other people. But there's other theories that could be applied. I mean, and we're only at the beginning of really sort of making sense of it. And I think Bourdieu's doxa is just one way of approaching it. I'm open to other suggestions on how to do that and what research is needed, and how we go about doing that research. And this, and I guess at some point we need to address the question about, how can we make it? Can we change it? I mean, what can we do to make it? Once we've sort of, at the moment, we're just sort of discovering it and making sense of it. And at some point, we're going to have to move on. The next step then will be to sort of address it once we've identified what the issues are and what the causes are, what the root courses. It must be like, once we've done that, then we can start moving forward to thinking about how we go about making some sort of change and actually dealing with it. I'll stop there because I've probably done my 5 minutes. So.
Thank you, Tristan. Very helpful. So the way this is formatted is that I'm now going to ask our other two guest academics to respond to Tristan's prompts, one after the other, and then I will move on to the next academic to present their response. Like I said, if you have questions now, don't, like in good debating society, don't say them yet, please. Put them into the chat for us so that we can pick them up later. So I'm going to invite Lucy now to respond, please, to this prompt.
I've got lots of things I could say on this. So it's a question of which to prioritize. I fully agree with the concerns that Tristan's raised. I think from informal observation, I've seen some changes taking place in some schools. And I think we need some large-scale data on this. I think there's no alternative for that because I've also seen, again, just my informal perspectives is that it varies a lot according to region of the world. It varies a lot according to the type of institution. So, for example, I know that Mark's going to talk about different forms of governance and ownership of schools as well and how that impacts on leadership. And I think we'll see, according to leadership differences, the governance differences will have an impact on the issues you raise. Another thing I would throw into the mix, if anyone is collecting this kind of large-scale data, is I think that we also need to investigate social class issues along with ethnicity and gender. So international schools have sometimes formed a route for people who would not be considered for positions of leadership in their host country because of their social class background. They wouldn't have been considered for elite institutions and yet ending up working in elite institutions in another country. And I think there's an interesting class dimension there, which definitely deserves kind of more explanation. Mark and I have looked at it in terms of, is this post-colonialism? Is it neo-colonialism? I think there's also something around schools operating as imagined communities. So we could draw on Anderson's work around a nationality as an imagined community. And for example, a school which claims to be offering a British curriculum, what is the Britishness or the Englishness that is imagined there? Often it seems to be like how England perhaps was 50 years ago, but it's not reflecting the Britain or England of today. So I'll leave it there. I'm just throwing out quite a lot of thoughts that I think are all important things to consider in investigating this further. But thank you very much, Tristan. Very interesting topic.
Fantastic, Lucy. That's really, really provocative and invigorating, I would say. I think it's amazing. And I'm going to go straight on now to Mark, please.
Thank you, Tristan. Yeah, sorry, thank you, Alex. And Tristan, yeah, fantastic. Sorry, I'm muted, aren't I? Am I muted? No, I'm not.
No.
Interesting data. I totally agree with Lucy. We do need more data, and particularly China might be quite different than other places. And I would want to pick up just something that Lucy just mentioned, which is something that's maybe hidden from just looking at documentary analysis in that way, that things like social class and I have, I'm sure Lucy's seen much more of this than myself, but I've seen people in positions of power who have low socioeconomic accents in the UK and wouldn't get a position, and that was across even in universities in Southeast Asia. And that's quite an interesting one to put in, because of course the accent isn't necessarily or regional accents aren't necessarily appreciated in different parts of the world and their social status. But whiteness is, because whiteness is really, really quite clear. And I know Alex has written a good paper on whiteness. And I would just want to throw this into the discussion. I don't know whether this whiteness of leadership is a co-constructed thing, in the sense that, is it what the consumer wants, i.e. the parents, or is it what the owners feel that the consumer wants? in terms of marketing their product of the international school. Most of them are for-profit organisations, and frequently when you go on the website, you get the nice glowing picture of the principal, and as you said, you're getting more host nation staff there, and you might find their names, might not find many of their pictures in the same way. And also, you could argue, is that also to do, as openly as said it to me in research that myself and Lucy have done, but that's about costings and finance, that they're cheaper to employ host nation people, but we train them well, as one was said to me. But I think it's all wrapped up in the business model of how these things are operating and markets, and that becomes quite difficult to look at too. But great paper, thank you, Tristan.
Thanks so much. Tristan, would you like to respond with a concluding remark before I move on?
Yeah, and I think what I've grasped from that is, I agree, is that it is complex and it is complicated, and there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and that probably explains why we're not able to sort of fully grasp it and explore it. We do need more data. We need, and I agree with Lucy, and it's not easy to get that data. So yeah, we're at a point where we do need a lot more research. We need a lot more help in terms of the data. But there is a little bit of data out there, but it's only sort of 100-200 schools, you know, and it tends to be the more sort of the traditional international schools, which is in the title of the paper that Alex and I wrote. So we weren't looking at the non-traditional, or particularly the school, many of the schools in Asia that have appeared, that we haven't sort of managed to identify who the leaders are and how they've got there. So yeah, it's very nuanced, and I think bringing in class is a good dimension. The paper that myself and Alex wrote was based on data that we got from the website of a leading recruiter of senior leaders, and looking at the sort of trying to work out from the job adverts the sort of person they were looking for. And one of the things that they were quite often mentioned a lot is that they were looking for a senior leader who had a strong sense of humor. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because that sort of raises quite interesting cultural issues as well. Is that, you know, some people, that sort of, you know, some cultures might not be quite happy with that as a leadership dimension, as an attribute of a leader. So there's, you know, there's quite a sort of nuanced sort of narrative that's out there as well, which is interesting and worthy of theorizing. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Tristan. Excellent. So, dear colleagues, please remember, if you have any thoughts or questions or prompts, please pop them in the chat now for this particular topic, which was monotone leadership of diversity. And I will now move on to Lucy. I've titled yours, Lucy, Splendid Isolation. The prompt here is in the foreground of it is Lucy's recent publication, 2023, Challenging the Internationalization of Education, a Critique of the Global Gaze. That's a monograph, a book by Routledge, published in London. So the prompt is, international school leaders often operate in isolated institutions, sometimes distanced from family networks and in communities with high rates of transition. This may impact on student, parent, teacher, and leadership well-being. Discussion of well-being in these schools needs adequate theorization and further exploration. Lucy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. I did prepare a slide on this, but it really doesn't want to share my screen at the moment. I will try again. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can, Lucy.
Oh, beaten the technology today then. Okay, so really this interest in looking at well-being has come out of a piece of research that I did with Mark himself. just after the pandemic, so in the initial post-pandemic period, and we weren't seeking to look at well-being. I'm not a social psychologist. I'm a sociologist of education. We were interested in looking at how the role of the leaders had perhaps been shifted by the pandemic. So we had a more general interest in what we were looking at. But at the same time, it was also conducted and the data was collected at a time when I think an interest in well-being was coming to the fore in schools generally, not just international schools specifically. There was a recognition that the well-being of children particularly, and also to some extent teachers had been adversely affected by all of those pandemic experiences. So that's the background to what we did. And when we found that what our participants wanted to talk about was well-being, we had to go back and dig back into that literature. And of course, well-being has a strong social component, as well as having kind of individual hedonic components. It also has a eudaimonic component, which is in part around the social meaning that's given to your role. So, it's a complex concept. We're not going to have time to dig into well-being today. But I think one of the things that we've started to look at was the many characteristics that international schools have, which create particular challenges for leaders and potentially for the well-being of leaders. And I've put these here on the right of the screen in front of you. There are things that make international schools specifically isolated as institutions. So they're isolated from each other. The international schools are all working in such different contexts that creates a level of isolation from each other. So even if you're in an IB school, if you're in an IB school in Mexico, you're going to face very different challenges to if you're in an IB school in China. And I think that the pandemic also highlighted that, the way in which you're actually very isolated and experiencing different things from each other. You're also isolated from other schools in your location because you're working with a different curriculum, a different assessment framework, different expectations from the community, and so on. So you're also isolated in that way. And I think thirdly, the other component which makes them feel isolated as institutions is for some schools, and of course, all that I'm saying doesn't apply uniformly to all schools. For some schools, there's a high level of transience, not necessarily amongst the student body, but sometimes amongst the staffing body, sometimes amongst the leadership themselves, which means that those social bonds are perhaps not as strong as they might be in other schools. So that's the school as an institution. And I think you can add to that specific things that the leaders themselves might be experiencing, which make them isolated. So typically, if someone is an expatriate recruited from overseas as a leader, they are isolated from friendship and family networks that they would have had in their home country. And the nature of the international school community may mean that they're working in a context in which everybody who they have everything to do with, they're the principal for. But this is pretty different from a lot of urban schools and other contexts where it's easy to move away from your school community and be just a regular person when you're not there. Instead, you're defined in that leadership role sort of in every aspect of your life, and that can be quite isolating as well. So I think there are these underlying features of many international schools which create potential challenges for international school leader well-being, and they just haven't been explored so far. As Tristan said, it's a young field, and we know that the well-being of leaders in general, school leaders in general, is an under-researched area. So it's not surprising this is massively under-researched. So what did mine and Mark's research tell us? Well, I've shown some of the findings from that in the bottom left-hand corner of this panel. We found that these teachers, I won't go into all the details, it just isn't time. These leaders were experiencing stress, trauma. They reported feeling isolated. I think in nearly every interview, the leader broke down into tears and was expressing their distress at their experiences. They were feeling that their well-being was not taken seriously. Many of them spoke about whether they wanted to continue as leaders or not because of the trauma of the experience of leading an international school during this time. As I say, I don't have time to talk about all of this in detail, but these were we were kind of surprised by the extent to which we observed this. And they said two other things, which I think is really important. One is that they all talked about placing a priority on well-being in their schools after the pandemic. But when they talked about it, they meant student well-being and staff well-being. They didn't mean leadership well-being. And the other thing that they talked about, which is kind of in tension, is that they also talked about the interdependence of well-being of different members of the school community. So when they talked about their own stress and tensions, it came out of issues that they'd experienced where the well-being of teachers or the well-being of students or of parents have been jeopardized by the pandemic. So there's an irony there, isn't there? Like if everyone's interdependence is well-being, of their well-being is really critical, but you're not placing emphasis on the leadership well-being, then how can you fully and adequately address the well-being of other stakeholders? So what I think is really important out of this is to say we definitely need some more research in this area. We don't know the extent to which this has continued as a well-being challenge after the pandemic, but given the structural challenges of international schools, we could expect that it continues to be a problem. We don't know what are the ways to address it, and we need more research on that. So we don't know if there are supports that can be given inside the school, or if there are supports that international school organizations like the Council of International Schools or some of the other international school networks should be looking at addressing. But in terms of something that's a key issue for international school leaders, it's unlikely that this has gone away as an issue. And I think, therefore, it's imperative on us to place this as a priority for future research. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Very interesting. I'm going to hand straight over to Mark, please. Your response.
Right, thank you. Thanks for that, Lucy. It's really good. And just to fill in a couple of things from that, I think one of the things I would want to emphasize is how international school leadership appears to be different than, say, nation schools, where you have got people who are responsible for that school and the employees in it are in a framework of legal frameworks and things. So, for example, if we look to our country, whether it's a trust school or whether it's an LA school, there's responsibilities on those people for the well-being of the leader. Similarly with private schools here, but in international schools there is this short-termism and turnover of leaders, and one wonders about who's looking after them and consequences for them as people. And I think it is just a thing like Lucy's saying, it's not going to go away, and it's the pandemic just exposed things, I think, and writ them large that are already there, and it's going to be a seemingly a big issue, and it's an issue for people who are preparing for that role as well. How they prepare to understand that, when someone's telling me that he couldn't go back to his home country when his mother had died, and his owner didn't understand that, because he was just saying to him, "You're a leader, you can't show emotion to your staff." And so there's a cultural difference there that he had a problem with. But fantastic. Thank you very much for it, Lucy.
Thank you, Mark. Very good. Excellent. I will now pass on to Tristan.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks. I mean, what Lucy's research shows is this complexity of leadership in an international school. It got me thinking about a model, a framework that an ex-colleague of mine here in Bath was developing, the CELS framework, CELLS. Schools as complex, evolving, loosely linked systems. And there was a paper written about international schools as being particularly complex, evolving loosely linked systems. And I think that's a framework that we can develop much more from this research. It also got me thinking about work that frameworks that have been produced by Richard Caffyn, Caffyn, and he did his PhD here at University of Bath, and it was about the boundary management. So you saw leadership as being about managing boundaries, and his work was showing just how complex the boundaries are, particularly the invisible boundaries are in international schools. And that's work that also could be developed. I think that framework could also be developed much more in terms of looking at international schools as institutions and making sense of what it's actually like to lead an international school. Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan. And straight back to Lucy for any concluding remarks there, please.
I think the only thing I would like to add is I think there's a lot of commonalities between what Tristan was discussing, what I'm discussing, because I think we have to go back and look at how good leadership is defined and whether we're seeing schools implicitly adopting, as Mark said, sort of a masculine, traditionally masculine view of the leader as not expressing emotions, as being firmly decisive instead of working in a more collaborative way. And I think that we need to understand how good leadership is defined in these institutions, because that might be working in both these ways, to both place well-being challenges on the individual leaders and also to be contributing to these structural inequalities as who is seen as a potential leader of the institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Great discussion there. Now, please, again, colleagues, if you have any thoughts or prompts, please put them into the chat. And I'm going to move on now to Mark. So Mark has highlighted a paper written together with Lucy, 2021, Navigating the Blurred Lines Between Principalship and Governance in International Schools Leadership and the Locus of Ownership Control. That's in the International Journal of Leadership in Education. So Mark's prompt is titled International School Leadership and the Locus of Control. The market growth of international schools has included both intra and transnational chains of schools. These new school grouping actors produce differing models of governance with varying layers of management, providing navigation issues for individual international school leaders. The locus of control shifts from the school to a differing global regions, creating a loss of autonomy and new roles of school leaders. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much. Once again, I'll share my screen if I may. With a bit of luck. Can you see my slide?
Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, so that's paid for people I haven't seen it. So just this one area that I wanted to focus on for today's rig was just looking at how these schools, these new emergent schools, are changing potentially leadership. So the sort of traditional international school, and then go back to say Mary Hayden's work, is that you've got a unitary owner. Now that might be a private school, it might be an individual owner, or it could be anything like a not-for-profit and a parental collective. But nonetheless, they're separate institutions. Those leaders might work together with other people and meet and things, but nonetheless, the sort of response for the leader of dealing with undertaking leadership decisions is done with someone who might even have an office at the side of theirs. And some of this is written about in earlier work on international school leadership. But we've seen this emergence of chains, and of course, this is also reflected in state-funded schools and private schools in other regions, which I'll mention at the end. But nonetheless, we get these different form of change where it seems to shift where that locus of control is. Is it within that site of that school, or has it moved elsewhere? So you've got chains where there might be within one country, but nonetheless, there's a single owner or an owner company that might have, I don't know, 3 or 4 different schools in different regions for different markets even. And we noticed some of that in our work that Lucy and I did, is that there was, schools from the same company are creating different schools and expect the leader to run that school in a different way for looking at different groups. And particularly in Malaysia, we found even that was even down to different ethnic groups and put a different curriculum on and etc. And of course, then the leader would be expecting to run that school with that curriculum, not necessarily the curriculum that they would wish. So we've got it within the institute, within the country. And then, of course, we've got big global players like Nord Anglia and GEMS. And some of these took part in our research, although research was, all the schools were in Malaysia. Where they were run from was a different matter, and they might have a regional rep. So there was one school in Malaysia who was the country, the actual ownership of the school was well, seemingly based in I think Dubai, and the local rep was based in Vietnam. So how does that operate? Have all these schools got a commonality between them, or they're just for different markets? And so is it Starbucks model where you know what you've got wherever you go, or is it something that's got an ownership organization, but the actual schools themselves might be more local to, so is it the global or the glocal? And those sort of issues are obviously affect how a leader will lead their school. And you sometimes wonder whether or not then there's a loss of autonomy more than you would have done in the top one of a unitary owner. And whether you as a leader of the school actually becoming what I've put here as the branch manager. It's a Sainsbury's and you're running the local Sainsbury's branch, as opposed to running something that's much more your own school, and you having much more autonomous decisions to make. But it is also reflected, as I said at the beginning, of areas that are happening in similar things that are happening in other schools. I've written a bit about this too. So you've got MATs in England, you've got the free schools in Sweden, charter schools in the US, all quite often operating as chains. And so moving forward, we're getting interesting phenomena occurring. And we're also getting, if I look at those things, they're like, for example, charter schools in the US, we're getting the blurring of lines between the private and the public. And one wonders in the future what will start happening with international schools. Could you get pay? We postulated at the end of this paper that could we foresee things like charitable, in inverted commas, organisations like MATs in England being involved in running for-profit institutions in Southeast Asia. It's a new world, and how people would run in those worlds, and is an area of leadership that, once again, I think we need much more research upon. But it's a quickly changing phenomena, and quite often we're following changes, structural changes, and trying to discover what's left behind. Because sometimes they're not actually by design; they're unintended consequences that might occur from such things. And I think that's about the 5 minutes.
Thank you. Very, very timely there, Mark. Well done. Thanks a lot. And of course, fascinating. And I'll go straight over to Tristan, please, for your response.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mark. I mean, this moves us into the area of networks and of international schools. We know now that 30% of the 14,000 international schools belong to a network or a group of some sort, a branded network. So the Nord Anglia, GEMS Education, Dulwich College International, etc. I mean, what it shows to me particularly is going back to the cells framework, is what we see here is the loosely linked systems. Yeah. And I think this is where we can develop it. It's because these international schools, as I say, traditionally they were autonomous, they were quite independent, single unit institutions, whereas now they quite often belong to a network, a loosely linked system of some sort. And I think this is where we can maybe develop that bringing the sort of institutionalization theory a little bit more. So thanks for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Tristan. And over to Lucy.
So I have some ambivalence about the development of the changes. So I see some potential for holding international schools or their networks accountable for some of the issues that we've raised. So, you know, Tristan's presentation was about concern about the unrepresentative nature of leadership in many institutions. Now, when you've got an individual school, how can you say that a single leader is unrepresentative? You can't. And so no institution is ever held accountable for those structural inequalities. And the same, you know, in less obviously, but I think it still applies to my concerns about principal well-being. Although I'm concerned about the potential McDonaldization of these educational institutions, there's also a potential here that the chains, the branded networks do introduce some form of accountability for looking at the systematic effects of these chains. I think it raises the question, though, of who, where, and what location is the home base of the institution, and what are the social norms or the concerns and the priorities of those hosts for not the schools, but for the networks, which is perhaps where some of the struggles will continue to be raised. So to explain that one more sentence, if I might have a concern as an individual parent or an individual teacher working in a chain of schools, where do I say this is wrong, and how do I say it's wrong according to what standards? Like, where do I point myself? Do I point to my country of origin? Do I point to where is hosting my school? Do I point to the place where the chain is hosted? And they could all be completely different and all have very different expectations of what constitutes inequality, social inequality in those contexts. That's it.
Thank you, Lucy. Great. Right. So back to you, Mark, for a concluding remark, please.
Well, big thank you for both of those comments, but particularly actually the accountability issues are going to be very interesting one, because it does link with what, you know, the lack of diversity and equity that Tristan was saying earlier. And because, of course, in many countries, they won't necessarily have such laws, anti-discriminatory laws. So Malaysia, where both Lucy and I have looked at, it's not, there's no laws on, you know, you can there's no laws on issues surrounding gender and race in terms of employment legislation. But if a British-based company is operating in Malaysia, then would they be accountable? You said rhetorically.
Thank you very much. Well, I think, colleagues, we can all see that this conversation is starting to open up Pandora's box of international schools. The many, many complexities therein, and we've just brushed the surface here. So now I'm going to start handing over the conversation to you. We already have a comment here from Joe, And he was mentioned. Joe, you know what? I'll just let you explain what you wanted to say there. I think it was a question to Lucy.
Right. It's a little bit verbose, isn't it? So probably best straight from the horse's mouth. Yeah, very briefly, I was inspired by what you were saying, Lucy, and it gave me pause for thought about my own context, where certainly I've lent into some of my own challenges navigating the international school landscape, and having studied counselling previously, I naturally kind of draw analogies, and Jung's concept of the wounded healer I found a powerful one for thinking about what I think you were describing as something of a fulcrum in that interdependence of well-being, that a leader who can honestly but judiciously engage with their own vulnerability can maybe bring to the role of well-being in schools. Yeah, any thoughts on that, research in that domain, anything you heard from people you were interviewing about such concepts?
So I would say yes and no. The no being really based on my own background. I'm a sociologist, so that's the lens that I brought to it. And I think perhaps your comments sound very, very interesting, and also show the, I guess, the fertility of maybe looking at this through multiple lenses. This is coming from a very different perspective, so I'm not familiar with it, but it does resonate with some of what I heard the participants say when they're saying sort of like they were they were feeling personally desperate themselves, and yet having to stay strong, as they talked about all kinds of things, like having to stay strong through a staff member committing suicide, and having to support their colleagues through, really traumatic things to happen to the whole of the institution at the same time as they were obviously hurting themselves. So thank you for that. That's really interesting perspective on it.
Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Nidal, please.
Hello. Thanks for this interesting session. I have to just say that I'm speaking to you today from Lebanon, so my connection might get horrible at some point. I'm going to try to be quick. So everything we've enjoyed listening to has been really interesting, and I think the most interesting aspect is the connection of all these things together. So probably the point, I'm going to bring up about 3 points, but I think they're really connected. So Lucy's point on the social class, intersectionality of social class, ethnicity lens in terms of leaders and the appointment of leaders, and how that kind of plays itself out in international schools. And I can relate to my own research in the Middle East in international schools. So people who, or leaders who can be coming from working class families or backgrounds, for example, can have higher chances of being appointed as leaders in international schools in the Middle East, because they are still white men mainly, and I agree with that. But it's very unlikely to have people from working class, from other ethnicities in these positions. That's really rare. So it's kind of interesting to see why. And when I was writing this note on why, I heard Mark saying something about, is it the owners who want this aspect to be highlighted or presented because they want to market it as a kind of a privileged commodity for the parents? Is it the parents who want this? And I think there is a lot about post-coloniality or colonial legacies in the East in general, probably the East and Africa, but my work is mainly in the Middle East. So I think there's an aspect of self-orientalization, Orientalism, and other things related to post-colonial influences in that. And then the last point I wanted to bring out is that everything we see about international schools research kind of, I mean, at least this group of esteemed scholars explores and focuses on the social aspects and the sociology of international schools, which is great. However, in reality, in the practice of international schools and all the reports around that, there is so much focus on the success as kind of business and the academic aspects. What is missing is the social dimension. And I think that's an area where I will get back to Tristan's initial remark on the lens through which we explore international schools. I think we probably need a kind of a mixture of sociological lenses or perspectives to explore further what is happening and why do they look like islands or kind of isolated entities. They're isolated from the societies they exist and they function in, isolated from the communities they're serving. They're just successful business endeavors, and the students do get to some of the best universities, but is that all? And I think that aspect is something I would like to probably hear from you about. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nidal. And it's lovely to see you here, Nidal. We spoke a while back. We haven't seen you since. So it's lovely to see you here. Thank you for engaging in our rig. Colleagues, I'm going to have to go now in a second, and I'm going to hand over to Tristan, my co-convener, who is going to lead until the end, which goes until 1:15. Before I go, though, I noticed that I'd like to also ask a question, so I'll do that now. I noticed that my three colleagues all stressed the importance of theory and theorization in the field of international schools. And it's something that I would also like to highlight. What Nidal was talking about now is a field that, because of its emergent nature and the fact that it's relatively new, we know little about it. What we know is hidden in anecdotes and stories and assumptions. We don't have any theory yet. We don't really have much to go on. And this is the important work that's happening now in groups like this, where we are beginning to theorize a reality. Theory is so important here because without theory, we run into reification, we run into doxa. So we run into a space where people's imaginings become realities and where notions such as transformational leadership become imbued with something that they don't have and will never exist. People interpret and divine their own hermeneutic inside these meanings. And therefore, theory in this context is so important because without it, we're in the Wild West. We're really in the dark. So I thank you all, my colleagues, today for coming together for this. Some amazing contributions. And without further ado, Tristan, I hand over the chair to you.
Okay, thanks, Alex. See you later. Yeah. Okay, so we got a question from Joseph. Joseph, are you there? Do you want to tell us about this?
Oh, good morning, everybody. Well, it's morning for me. Apologies for keeping my camera off for part of this, but it was this started at 6 a.m. I'm really excited to be listening to this, but I'm trying to think about the applied nature of a lot of the teaching that I do. We have both PhD and EdD streams, MEd streams, and MA streams. And a lot of the students who come to us through the professional stream are interested in learning about how to take a research agenda back to work and do their jobs differently and better. And I'm just really curious to know how the emergent research agenda that folks have been talking about here appears in your own teaching, if at all, and how you try to strike the balance between some of the more kind of applied questions that students may really want answers to versus the more theoretical questions that may be driving you from a disciplinary perspective. And if that question doesn't take off, my feelings will not be hurt. So I just tried to think through some of this stuff.
Okay, thanks, Joseph. Mark, is that you got?
Yeah, I could say a few things if you wish, Joseph. That would be.
Go ahead.
If you look at each of those presentations, there are, and this is just a small amount of issues that are to do with solely to do with leadership of international schools. I think there's a whole host of things there that people could pick up and do dissertations and theses upon. On each of those presentations, there are areas that would suit a professional doctorate, for example, to look carefully at. One of the things that Lucy didn't mention that in her presentation that about our work, that when we were interviewing people, and when they talked on that section of how they felt and about being isolated and working, some of them got very distressed, as she said, but we got the impression that apart from other people in their family, they hadn't really spoken about these issues to other people. So there's nothing there in structural support from the small little sample that we did. But, you know, as a thing that's come across, I think, is a whole multitude of range of international schools there are now. And there could be all sorts of things that are quite different than what we've touched on today in any of your students that may wish to pick up on any of these and run with it and add to the field, because it's a very, very, very new field. There's all sorts of areas of literature gaps, as we say. Hope that's useful.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Lucy, anything to add to that?
Not really, because I now lead teacher training for government schools in Bahrain. So I'm not teaching around international schooling at all at the minute. No doubt that'll change in the future. I wanted to circle back to what Nidal said. And I thought the point that you made about these are basically businesses, you know, these are individual businesses. I think what's interesting, though, is the way that the rhetoric of being international is used. And that's one of the things I talk about in my most recent book, which is really critiquing this notion of being global or being international, looking at it as a rhetorical device, which is used to make these schools sound connected. I mean, international, it sounds so connected. You know, many of these schools, they'll have, you know, visuals, which are little pictures of people holding hands around the world. And it sounds like we're all together. And yet, these are very isolated institutions. So it's sort of this rhetoric of connection and being individual and being international and being global is serving to conceal some of these isolating elements, which are about individual businesses operating to make a profit in some instances, although not all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, going back to Joseph's question, Joseph, I can say a little bit about my own experience here at University of Bath, because we have a lot of EdD students, I think 230 currently, plus about 70 PhD students, and many of them are leaders of international schools. So I can speak from a little bit of experience of having taught many leaders of international schools over the past 10 years. And we adopt the way that we teach our leadership on our leadership units is we tend to approach international schools as organizations, and there's a lot of organizational theory that can be applied. And we also introduce the notion of them being institutions, because organizations, they're not just schools, they're international schools. And that means that they need to look like international schools, like, so that this brings in the sort of complexity and the dualities that Nidal was mentioning, and the paradoxes that have been mentioned as well. There's been quite a number of paradoxes that have been mentioned. So there's a lot of leadership theory that can be applied to international schools as organizations and as institutions. Just to develop that, the other dimension that we also discuss here at Bath is we take the view that we've been talking about leadership. Is it leadership, or is it management, or is it administration? And that's something else that we need to consider. I mean, the senior leaders of international schools, are they really leaders? I'm thinking particularly those that are in the networks and the groups of schools. Are they leaders, or are they? I mean, how much leadership is it actually leadership that they're practicing, or is it management? Are they managing the school? I was interested with Mark's notion of a branch manager. You know, this supermarket metaphor. I mean, maybe that's, you know, the manager is being a manager the same as being a leader. And this is a framework that we adopt here at Bath, where we discuss what is leadership and how does it differ from management? How does it differ from administration? And are they the same thing? And are we actually talking about school leaders, or are we talking about something else? So I hope that does that help you, Joseph?
It's terrific. Thanks. It gives me a lot to think about. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Have we got any more comments there? Rania, did you want to say something? Did you want to comment on something?
Yes, hi everyone. Sorry, I didn't open my camera earlier due to driving. This is very informative and thank you for sharing. And I would just echo what you had emphasized regarding the methodologies that we're using, which usually it either comes from business, if we're focusing on the business model of the school, or it's coming from a different background, which we need to pre-identify what kind of methodologies that we're using to explore international schools or international education. And the other thing is, which you had just mentioned, when we're talking about private schools, some private schools follow national curriculum. However, they try to mirror international way of running the school. So sometimes there's kind of confusion when we're trying to explore what's happening at the region. And most of the international school leaders that I interviewed, and I originally from Jordan and I work in Qatar. So they would just simply say there is no clear policy in the country that they are working on. So they don't know exactly what's required from them. And they just follow what they had used to do previously. So there are lots of things happening within this realm or this division or way. And as you mentioned, is it leadership, management, or administration, which we need to explore? There are lots of things on the research agenda that we can develop and generate from this. But understanding the position or the research design that we're following, I think that would be an interesting start and would help everyone to start identifying and speaking the same language or having clear expectations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think what I got from that comment is it reminds me of the issue about legitimacy, and this is something we haven't discussed, but it's something we talk about a lot here at Bath, about how one of the tasks facing the senior school leader of international schools increasingly in many regions is they're having to prove that they're an international school. But at the same time, they're having to deliver a national curriculum, and they've got more local children, and that makes them look more like national schools. So there's this issue about legitimacy and the role that a senior leader has in legitimizing an international school as a particular type of institution. And I think that's becoming, so that's probably an area of research that we could develop. And it, you know, as we've discussed, it's very contextualized. So it's going to look very different in the Middle East. It's probably going to look very different in Qatar than it would in China or in Bolivia or even other parts of, or even parts of Northern Europe. Have we got any more?
Can I just add a little bit there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
To the debate, because it's interesting what Rania is saying about methodologies, and of course, you know, we've got 4 people leading this session today, and we're all white. We're all British in origin. I don't know any work. Here's one for you, Tristan, of anyone analysing the ethnicity of the people who are speaking about international schools in academic research, i.e. the researchers and authors, who could well be predominated by white, maybe even white male. And that's interesting in itself, isn't it? Because it's their voice that's appearing in the written work. Food for thought.
No, Mark, you raised an issue that we're aware of, aren't we? I mean,
yeah.
Quite conscious of, and we're native English speakers, and we could go on. You know, we could go on and say.
Well, the irony in terms of methodologies, I'm absolutely convinced that some of the data that sometimes you get in that from empirical work, sometimes people share things with you that they might not share with a host section person.
Mark and I have had some very uneasy conversations, I think, when collecting data, where people have assumed that we've shared a perspective or shared views about the host country. And I think that has given us data we wouldn't have been otherwise able to get. And it's been very uncomfortable, actually, very uncomfortable as a researcher.
The paper that we did that's got post-colonial in the title has got quite a bit of that, and you know, people were sharing quite clearly with us thoughts at times were openly racist, believing obviously that we would feel the same way. We just let the recording continue, but yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon.
Thank you very much. We've got a few hands up, I think. Oh, we've got 3 hands up. I can only see one. I can only see Joe's. So Joe, off you go, and then I'll find the other 2 hands.
Okay, yeah. Well, Tristan, I spent many years reading and writing about you when I did my PhD, thinking about the IB and institutions. So the field has kind of changed since then, but I want to take this opportunity to ask you a question about the IB and institutions. Aligned with the point that was made earlier today about the increasing plurality of international school networks and the decline of the influence of the IB. And then the question is, does this decline of the IB possibly involve a step backwards in terms of the field's ability to institutionalize the kind of positive changes we're talking about today, like DEI, where 10 years ago, like a progressive institutional change could be proliferated quite quickly through IB networks. This would be less impactful now because, as Nidal and others have pointed out, we've got all these players who are much more singularly profit-oriented with their own networks. So we've got competing institutional networks and logics, and well-intended voices like ours can just get lost in the late capitalist kind of, frenzy of putting out new schools.
Yeah, I mean, Joe, I think what you're referring to there is just some people might not be aware that there's been quite a big shift, hasn't there, in terms of international schools being IB schools. I mean, there was a time when there was a traditional normative, in some way sort of a normative model of an international school did the IB, whereas now there's been a big shift away. What is it? Maybe 20% of international schools now are IB schools, IBDP schools. So, and a lot of them, as I mentioned in my own presentation, there's been this diversity of curricula. However, Lucy did mention a bit of a paradox that in terms of with the groups, and this was something that myself and Alex mentioned at the Belmas conference. We raised an issue at the Belmas conference in Belfast this summer, where we said that we approached some research that we were doing into diversity of leaders amongst the groups, the for-profit groups. We approached it with the idea that we thought that they would have more diversity because they are branded, and some of them are even listed on stock markets with shareholders and a public profile. We thought that they would actually be more diverse because they're not hidden, they're not isolated. And in fact, what we found is that the diversity, the level of diversity in the for-profit groups was just as the same as it was with the traditional international schools. So there is a bit of a paradox, but there's another sort of paradox there that opens up. I found the other people. So Susie, you got your hand was up.
Yeah,
okay,
apologies
maybe.
for.
Oh, hear that, yeah.
Yeah, apologies for being late. My small brain can't cope with moving between different countries. So I was at one of the international schools in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, but I'm now involved with university level to do with masters in international and comparative education, and basically trying to make profit by exporting it. But what was interesting to me there was listening to what you were mentioning about the sort of the insider-outsider debate and how you gain different sort of levels of information and level of knowledge. But what I wanted to bring up was about the issue around decolonization and sort of the racism associated with it, which I'm finding is quite an interesting side of it, because I am assumed to be white, which yes, technically I am. And if I were to switch languages, because there's more than one of you, immediately I am not necessarily a native English speaker. I just happen to speak English. And the situation in our own country, in Scotland, around in Gaelic, is an issue of colonisation and latent racism towards one language. And I found that again in Ethiopia, one language versus another. However, when it comes to then the policies that we're all creating to enact in this, we are only viewing decolonization or the inclusion of non-racist. For example, ours is only going to ever be considered at our university if the inclusion of those that are Black, Asian, or minority ethnic, according to a very, very small parameters of what it is, rather than being truly inclusive and truly anti-racist. That they're only considering, and that itself appears to be sort of a racist orientation towards it. So, you know, it's how we as in the international sector actually deal with that, with the perceptions of our own pupils, but more often our own staff and then the administrators. Okay, thank you. Mark, Lucy, do you want to respond to that? Any response to that?
I'm fine, conscious of time as well. So thank you. Great, Susie. Thank you.
Yeah, I just think these are really, really interesting debates. And I just want to put in a note of optimism before we all leave on a down, I guess, because people have raised some very, very serious concerns. And I think, again, from having been into international schools, we shouldn't undermine the potential for change from the young generation. So you said, for example, Joe, that maybe a generation ago, we could roll out change through IB networks, and that's sort of been eroded. But I think the current teenagers in international schools and the social media networks that they have access to, and the challenges and the questions that they're raising, could equally be a source of change. And I'm speaking as a parent who's put many a child, I've got 4 children, through international schools, and I hear what they're talking about, and I hear the questions that they're raising with their very international networks. And I do see some potential for remaining optimistic despite these, you know, really ingrained forms of racism and other forms of inequality in the institutions.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. I would just echo as well that I know anecdotally that the accreditation agencies, okay, most international schools are not accredited. That's another issue, but the accreditation agencies are starting to address some of these issues, and or at least they're wanting to address them. So I think there is going to be some change.
I would just say on what Lucy's raised there as a positive note, and irrespective of what we're saying academically about such institutions, most of them have got a very diverse set of children involved, and children are meeting. Okay, they might be all fee paying, so they might be from a select group in their societies, but they are nonetheless meeting a whole range of people, maybe more diverse than many other schools they would go to.
Right, thank you. We've just got a couple of minutes, and I can see number 7, number 7.
I think number 7 might be me.
I think it is. Hi, Tony.
And I just want to start by thanking Tristan and Alex for setting up this rig and having this very important inaugural session. My background, first of all, I was privileged to be the supervisor for Alex's PhD. And I've also worked closely with Lucy and Mark in Malaysia. And just to, I think, raise the point about who are the researchers and are we universally white? I have had 2 non-white PhD students, one who's now completed and published, this is Wahid, and one who is close to finishing and who is ethnically Chinese Malaysian, Lam Chi Fong, who is a principal of a private school and researching the work of principals in international schools in Malaysia. So I think we are beginning to widen the pool, as it were, of people who are involved in research in this important area, but obviously we've still got a long way to go. But really, on behalf of BELMAS, just to say thank you to the presenters and to the hosts, and keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, so on that note, we'll finish dead on time. So it's 12:15 here in Bath. So thank you very much to presenters and to people and to the audience.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just say one thing? I'm kind of late to.
You'll have to be very quick.
Yes, very quick. I just want to give a shout out to my professor, Joe Flatza, who's here, who helped me through my doctoral in education. And also want to thank Tristan, Mark, Lucy, and Alan for all your research that came out. I started in about 2015. There was not much out there. And as your research came out, it gave me so much to work through when I was doing my doctoral on international leadership. So thank you all. And this has been such a lovely event to attend. So just wanted to get that out there. And nice to see you, Joe.
Yeah, thanks. And just to say that we might meet up, some of us might meet up in Scotland.
Yes, I look forward to it.
Yeah, see you in Glasgow. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we'll finish there. And I don't know, Mark and Lucy, do you want to stay on just for a minute or two?
Yeah.
And otherwise, thank you, everybody, and see you at the next meeting.
Thank you, cheerio, and look forward to seeing you in Glasgow.
In Glasgow, yeah.
Thanks so much.